Ambassador Michael Froman is the current president of the Council on Foreign Relations. Ambassador Froman previously served as U.S. trade representative in President Obama's cabinet, where he led major global trade initiatives, including the Trans-Pacific Partnership and agreements at the World Trade Organization. Before that, he was Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economic Affairs at the White House, shaping U.S. policy on trade, finance, energy, and climate change. His career spans leadership roles in both government and the private sector, including senior positions at Citigroup and MasterCard. He is a graduate of Harvard Law School and a Fulbright recipient, making him one of the country's foremost voices on international economics and diplomacy. Thank you so much for coming to the 15th Concordia Annual Summit. As I mentioned, this is the first time the president of the Council on Foreign Relations has been to Concordia, so this is your Super Bowl as well this week.
It's a busy week.
So let's talk about this week. United Nations General Assembly. I oftentimes say it's such an important moment for the world because it's the one constant by which the majority of the world's heads of government are all within about 30 blocks of one another.
That's right.
Yesterday, we heard from the President of the United States a speech that I think in many ways shocked a lot of people in terms of its tone, in terms of its focus on the UN as an institution, but also some of the dramatic policy changes we saw play out in real time. Let's talk about President Trump's address to the United Nations and where you see President Trump's worldview and foreign policy view within the context of a multilateral body like the United Nations.
Sure. Well, first of all, I think, as in so many areas, President Trump has a rather unconventional way of presenting his views. But when you look beyond some of the noise, it's hard to argue with the assertion that the UN isn't meeting its potential. Or it's hard to argue that the UN hasn't played as big a role in solving wars around the world as one would hope. And so there are always nuggets of truth or nuggets of things that require attention in the president's speech, even if he surrounds it with, as you say, sort of unconventional, shocking sometimes approaches to conveying that information. So I'm hopeful that the audience that was there, and as you said, it's really important that so many leaders were sitting there and hearing it directly, will take that and say, okay, here's somebody who says he wants the UN to do more. He says he believes in the UN. Later in the day, he said he stands behind the UN. He's just disappointed that they haven't been able to achieve what they were set out to achieve. Hopefully, it will take that message and do something with it. Because as you know better than I, UN is only as strong as the consensus of the major states and of all the states ultimately. And right now, the consensus is not very strong. And so where you have divisions, where you have polarization, it's not the UN's fault per se that it can't get anything done. It's the fact that the countries don't agree on what should get done and how the UN should operate. The other thing I would say, I thought it was interesting that throughout the speech, he really focused on what he perceives to be the dysfunctionality of the political part of the UN, the issuing strongly worded statements versus getting deeply involved in some of the conflicts around the world. He never mentioned the UN agencies like UNICEF or the World Food Program or the High Commission on Refugees, who do amazing work on the ground. I don't know whether he is aware of the kind of work that they do, but there really are two UNs. There's the UN in the field, and there's the UN in New York and Geneva. And whatever his criticism is of the UN in New York and Geneva, the UN work in the field deserves to be supported.
There was polling released this week that talked about, first, the immense lack of trust at this point of the UN at an all-time low, confidence in the UN at an all-time low globally. This isn't just an American or US-based poll, but this is global. Where do they start in an effort to reform, to change, to modernize for the world as it is?
Well, there's a lot of attention being paid to issues like the reform of the Security Council itself. I actually am not sure that would have a significant impact, because if you enlarge the number of countries that had vetoes from 5 to 10 or 12 to make it more representative of the rest of the world, it's still a veto-oriented activity, and any one country or any couple of countries that don't share the consensus can prevent any meaningful action from happening. I think if the UN as an organization, got more deeply involved in the biggest issues facing the world today, like the war in between Russia and Ukraine, like the war in Sudan, like the war in Gaza, but found a way to do so that was not that all the parties could accept as being legitimate. I think that would be show a meaningful step in the direction of building trust with a broader public.
Of course. I think diplomacy feels like how it functions, how it operates. Diplomacy, the traditional modes by which diplomatic circles have operated for a long time are changing dramatically. We saw even, for instance, one meeting between the president of the United States and the new president of Syria, and a dramatic policy change overnight, immediately. How do you envision and how do you see us adapting and changing how we approach foreign policy, how we approach diplomacy for this time?
Well, look, every administration reflects the personality and the approach of their leader, right? And clearly this administration, the Trump administration, is a very personal administration to the president himself. So as you said, the president made a very quick decision on Syria. The president met with President Zelensky of Ukraine and came out with a fundamentally different view on whether Ukraine could reacquire all of its territory through military means with sufficient support from NATO and from the European Union. And so it's become very personalized. Now, that's not true with every country. It's not true historically with the United States. Usually that personal diplomacy is backed up with a lot of preparation, a lot of policy coordination across the agencies, a lot of work beforehand to make sure that the agreements are there. This administration has a very different approach, and I think we're all learning to adjust to that. In some ways, I mean, there's something slightly refreshing about a focus on leaders and leaders having dialogue. And when I was in government, I'd been involved in the G8 at the time and the G20 summits, and I often thought that the most valuable asset that the world has is a leader's time. And if the leaders could just sit down together and have unscripted, non-talking point conversations with each other, that would be a very valuable contribution to international relations. It rarely happens. I think this president has taken that as his default, which is to walk in, perhaps without notes, without talking points, to make decisions based on what he believes is a very good instinct, and then to bring the rest of the government along with it.
You recently wrote a piece for Foreign Affairs called After the Trade War, and you talked specifically saying that essentially the trading system we have now is dead. What do you mean by that?
Well, look, the U.S., chief among other parties, but also other parties in Europe, elsewhere, after the Second World War, began this process of putting together the multilateral rules-based trading system. And over 80 years, it reduced tariffs among countries. It helped countries integrate with each other. It's probably the most powerful force towards alleviating poverty in human history, lifting hundreds of millions, if not over 1 billion people out of poverty, created great economic well-being generally around the world. Now, the problem was that the benefits of globalization were not equally shared, and that the costs of globalization were acutely felt, particularly in advanced industrialized countries like the United States, by workers in particular sectors and particular geographies, manufacturing workers. And so that led to a political reaction. Now you have a sense in which the major functions of the global trading system, to negotiate trade agreements, to enforce trade agreements, to monitor countries' trade policies, they're all basically broken. The World Trade Organization, the WTO, its major three functions are basically broken. And you also have China, which has long followed its own set of rules, being joined by the United States, which is now following its own set of rules. And when you've got the two largest economies in the world going their own direction, then what's left of the multilateral rules-based system? It's really an open question because there are countries, Europe, Canada, other middle countries, who are committed to upholding the old rules of the system, even if the two largest economies of the world don't. And on the other hand, I think there's going to be a great move towards, rather than big multilateral agreements with 160 plus countries signing on to them, that we get smaller groups of countries, like-minded countries, to come together, coalitions of the willing, coalitions of the ambitious, and working where they can on a joint set of standards and rules that will govern their economic relations. Maybe much more fragmented and maybe less efficient, but I think it may be more politically sustainable over time.
You talk about coalitions, and I think the visual of President Xi standing right in the middle between Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin. What message is he trying to send as that image went around the world?
You forgot Prime Minister Modi.
But he didn't go to the parade.
Oh, not to,
I'm talking about a military
parade.
Excuse me.
Well, look, I think certainly there are countries who have come together who've been somewhat resistant to elements of the U.S.-led system of the last 80 years. They haven't necessarily put forward an alternative that the rest of the world is adhering to, but they have come together to, in my view, challenge and in some cases undermine the U.S. led rules-based system. I think the challenge is for those countries. There may be less there than meets the eye, whether it's those three countries. You can add Iran to that, what people used to call the axis of autocracies or the axis of the aggrieved. You can talk about the BRICS, I think, in somewhat the same way. They have certain common interests, but they have a lot of differences. And, the differences between China and Russia historically are really quite strong, including border disagreements. And I don't expect that they're going to suddenly become close allies across all of their activities, but they have a common interest right now in trying to undermine the role of the United States in the world. And, I'm afraid that we're giving them more opportunity and more room to exercise that by ourselves, either alienating other countries, pushing them away from us, or pulling back and creating vacuums.
I have probably about 15 more questions I want to ask you about China, but and I will go back to China in just a minute. But you said something that I want to build on. Why does it feel, at least observing from the outside, why does it feel as if we, for some reason, can't have a difficult conversation with our allies? There seems to be this essence of this lack of ability to perhaps let these conversations play out. Instead, you see so much division between countries that were traditionally our allies. What do you see as the driver of that? Are you surprised by that?
I'm not sure I agree with that. I mean, I think we are having difficult conversations with our allies. Look, for several administrations now, as an example, the U.S. has pushed our NATO allies to spend more on defense, to get to 2%. And, sometimes there'd be a wink and a nod, and some would get up there. It's closer to 2%, but a lot were laggards, and we're basically relying on the U.S. to pay the bulk of the defense bill, to provide the defense umbrella for the Western alliance. I think between, again, several presidents, certainly President Obama, maybe President Bush before him, President Obama, President Biden, President Trump on one hand, and of course, President Putin invading Ukraine on the other hand, have finally gotten the Europeans and the other NATO members, Canada and elsewhere, to pony up more of a commitment towards defense spending. And it'll be very important to see not just how much they spend, but how they spend it. Do they spend it on things that really matter? Do they spend it well? Do they do the difficult things around consolidating their defense industrial base so that they are able to produce equipment at scale? Not every country has to have its own tank. Not every country needs to produce its own air defense system, and to really come together in a stronger alliance. I think that's the result of a hard conversation with allies. They haven't loved it, but they've all moved in that direction. I think on the trade side, we've yet to have the conversation of what comes next. President Trump has significantly disrupted trade relations with the rest of the world by imposing tariffs across the board. It's gotten the attention of the world clearly about what he believes to be the unfairness of the existing trading system. But we haven't yet had that dialogue. Okay, where does it go from here? And I think that's true of a lot of areas, to your point, where we're going to need to have hard conversations with allies to say the pendulum isn't going to just swing back to the way things were before. We need a new way of thinking about these issues, whether it's the international economy, the trading system, alliances, how we deal with adversaries, how we deal with technology. We need new ways of thinking about that, and that's going to require, some hard conversations with allies as well.
What are some factors you're looking at right now that make you worried?
Well, look, I worry about our own dysfunctionality here as a country, our political dysfunctionality and the polarization that we're seeing in society, but also through our governmental institutions. I worry about some of the institutions that I think are critical to a healthy democracy and ensuring that they remain strong as not just as a model for the rest of the world, but because it's been a key to our success as a country, and our success in terms of being the leading economy in the world, being the greatest innovator in the world. I think we just have to maintain those systems and those institutions very well. And I worry about our tendency, as I mentioned, to both push away allies and create vacuums for our adversaries or our competitors to fill. I think I think U.S. leadership continues to be important in the world. It may be a different kind of leadership going forward than it's been in the past, but I think leaving the field to others, we'd much rather be the one on the field helping define the rules of the road with our allies than leaving that to our adversaries and our competitors.
I don't want to put you too much on the spot, but if you're willing, could we go around the world a little bit with some fire round questions?
Sure.
The recent state visit in the UK, how did it go?
I think it went fairly well. I think the British are managing their relationship with the U.S. quite well. And I think particularly this technology agreement by which there'll be significant investment in the UK in some respects as the outpost towards Europe of our technological leadership. I think that is going to end up serving the British very well. It ends up, in retrospect, while they were criticized initially for signing the first trade deal and agreeing to 10% tariffs, I think a lot of other countries would be delighted to get 10% tariffs, to get the tariffs down to 10%. So I think the British have handled it fairly well. And I think that from the U.S. perspective, having a strong ally like Britain, who's very capable, potentially capable on the economic side if they can address some of their current issues, but also on the national security, military, and intelligence side, having a strong relationship like that is very important to us. I think building on that and expanding it to others would be very valuable as well.
But moving to Poland, do you see things escalating in Poland with some of this recent activity or actions by Russia? And of course, this shift, for now, the shift in view from President Trump in terms of engagement?
Well, look, I think we have to be very clear with Russia about NATO and about the NATO commitments, and that we do intend to defend NATO countries if there are incursions. And as the president said, in response to a question, if a Russian plane comes over Polish territory and tries to attack Poland, should it be shot down? And he's answered yes, and that is what Article 5 is really all about. So, we know that Russia has taken a number of steps short of kinetic action to disrupt activity in Europe: hybrid warfare, cyber warfare, sabotage, assassinations, et cetera. I think it's important that NATO demonstrate that they see it's happening, they know it's happening, and they're prepared to act in response.
What's next for Ukraine? Where do we go from here?
Well, as of the recent meeting between the president and President Zelensky, hopefully we're moving towards a world in which the U.S. provides active support, whether it's directly to Ukraine or through NATO and our European allies to Ukraine, to give them the capacity and also give them the permission to use that capacity to prosecute the war and change the situation on the ground. I think the key thing is for President Putin to have an incentive to come to the negotiating table. The president expected that to happen on day one. It didn't happen.
Things have escalated since the president's meeting with Putin in Alaska.
Absolutely. I mean, that was an opportunity to try and achieve a ceasefire as a way of getting to a peace negotiation. It did not succeed in that regard, and instead, Russia escalated their attacks.
Are you surprised by that?
Well, I think that was the opportunity for President Trump to say, we have to have a ceasefire. This idea that we can reach towards a peace negotiation without having a ceasefire first, I think was never going to work because there was no incentive. And so we have to change the dynamic on the ground so that President Putin has an incentive, whether it's through increased economic sanctions or increase support for Ukraine such that the situation on the ground is more threatening to President Putin. Whatever it takes for him to come and have a serious negotiation with Ukraine.
What do you see next in Gaza?
Look, it's a horrible situation, and look, we Americans always think if we just spend enough time on an issue, we're going to get a solution, and it just takes hard work. This is one of those where there is no good solution for the Palestinian people, for Israeli security, for the humanitarian crisis that exists there now. I would hope that one, we could ensure Israel's security first and foremost, but also ensure that the humanitarian aid that needs to get into Gaza and the humanitarian crisis that's growing there now is dealt with even as we work longer term for a solution that has a political element and a longer term element. And of course, we have the hostages that are still there, the 20 or so hostages that we believe are still alive that just need to be released. We forget that it's all started on October 7th with a horrible attack by Hamas, that there are hostages that need to be released, and that if Hamas released the hostages, it would eliminate a lot of the reason for Israel to continue their incursions into Gaza.
Are we awarding Hamas in a way through this declaration of statehood from all these countries all around the world?
I understand why countries are making these declarations. I don't think it actually advances the case of statehood in a meaningful way in this environment. In that, 3 years ago, there was a substantial portion of the Israeli public that was in favor of a two-state solution. Now that is effectively gone. And within the Palestinian community, again, there's been more radicalization. And so, everybody in the world, France, the UK, Canada, everyone's in favor of the two-state solution, except for two groups of people, the Israelis and a significant group of the Palestinians. And that makes it hard to imagine it coming true simply by issuing declarations.
You brought up India earlier. Many have said that the U.S. is potentially putting our relationship that has been such a priority for decades at risk. The U.S. has made very clear the buying of Russian oil is a key problem for them. But it also seems like Modi and Trump have a good rapport with one another. Where does this land?
Look, it's been, as you said, for the last 3 decades, really, since first Clinton, very much George Bush with the nuclear agreement, Obama, Biden. It's been a relationship that has evolved in a very significant direction in a positive way. It's not an alliance. We have our differences, but we're much closer to a strategic partnership than we'd ever been. I think we now have a setback. On one hand, as you said, the president and Prime Minister Modi seem to have a good relationship. On the other hand, there seem to be issues of difference, including over the role that the president played in the resolution of the recent tensions between Pakistan and India that have become politically volatile in India as well. And so I would hope we could get beyond this because strategically that's such an important relationship going forward. And again, day by day, on one hand, we hear about good conversations between the two leaders. And then we have an announcement about H-1B visas costing $100,000 a year or $100,000 period. And each of these items either take the relationship forward or step backwards. And it would be one thing if we're the only party playing. But the reality is, as we pointed out, China, Russia, others are also trying to exert influence, trying to attract India to join their coalition of countries aggrieved about the role of the United States. I tend to think of India as the ultimate polyamorous country, right? They love the United States for our defense cooperation, for our nuclear deal, for technology, for being a place where Indian entrepreneurs come to build great businesses. They love Russia for oil and for munitions. They love Iran for energy. They love and they hate China, depending on the issue and the day of the week. It's a country they've had actual military conflict with in the not so recent past. And so they're going to play all of these relationships in the way that most meets their interests. We can't afford to give up the field and not be engaging with them in this important way.
Let's end in Argentina. Fragile state, fragile economy?
Well, look, Argentina has a long history of economic fragility and crisis. This government has taken a number of incredibly difficult steps. I don't think people would have thought they would have been able to pull it off politically, economically. Still, it's very much a work in progress, but inflation has come down significantly. It's still much higher than it should be. They are trying very hard to demonstrate that they're going to uphold contracts and be a good place for foreign businesses to invest. I think the jury is still out on this experiment. But it's a country that probably needed a jolt, probably needed an experiment, because after 100 years of decline, through more traditional mechanisms, haven't worked.
Michael Froman, I think, as always, you remind us why the Council on Foreign Relations is essential and imperative. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you for having me.